Welcome to Loup TV. I'm your host, Gene Munster, along with Loup's very own Doug Clinton. Our topic today is SPACs. This is a well-traveled topic. Thankfully, we do have Doug here who has a superpower of trying to find alternative roads on a well-traveled topic. So I'm just going to kind of quickly frame this in. You're probably maybe getting a little bit fatigued about hearing about SPACs. That will be my first question, Doug, is should we be fatigued about hearing about SPACs, or is it important for us to hear about these because fundamentally they are going to become a bigger part of the investing future?
I think fatigued or not, we should be prepared to keep hearing about SPACs because I think that they are a part of capital allocation and they are going to remain a part of capital allocation as it pertains to the public markets going forward. We kind of think of SPACs as essentially public venture capital. The unique element of a SPAC is that you can talk about forward-looking numbers instead of just backward-looking numbers like you can in an IPO. And so it kind of opens the market to a different set of companies that may be a little bit earlier on in their life cycle. So I think SPACs are here to stay as a fixture in capital raising. I do think maybe some of the numbers we're seeing here, some of the amounts being raised do feel a little bit aggressive.
Just the aggregate dollars raised in SPACs in 2019, it was roughly 15 billion. That number went to 82 billion in 2020, and year to date, we're 2 months into the year, about 43 billion. So we've seen obviously this step up on track to be much bigger this year than last year, and everybody's
Gino,
kind of
just one thought to jump in on that. That trajectory, when you hear it, it sounds crazy. If you put that 40 billion so far this year, you multiply it by 6, we're halfway through the year, you're talking about almost 250 billion in SPAC dollars potentially raised on this trajectory. I think that one thing that everyone should understand is that because of the way SPACs are structured, there's sort of like a risk-free trade. You can think of it as a sort of like a zero coupon bond where you have this immense upside if the acquisition that the SPAC sponsor ultimately does is viewed in a positive way by the market. And I think especially in markets like we're seeing right now, where today I think the NASDAQ was down about 3%. We've had a very choppy week, especially in tech. I think people are even looking more for risk-free type trades just because they're afraid of, hey, are we in a bubble? We've been having this conversation since late last year, even before that. So this is kind of a safe trade in a way, and it makes sense that we're seeing the kind of spike that we're seeing.
When you talk about people looking for this, are you talking about the public or the large institutional investors into the pipe beforehand? You're talking about retail investors. Who are those that get the risk-free trade?
Today is mostly hedge funds that are investing directly into the trust of the SPAC. Sometimes you're starting to see, at least from what we're hearing, some institutional investors, long only oriented investors starting to invest in the trusts. And certainly the long onlys have been investing in pipes. I mean, we've seen Fidelities and Wellingtons and BlackRocks deploying into pipes and sort of getting in at the deal price, where oftentimes we're seeing these SPACs after a deal is announced be up 10, 15, 50, 100%, depending on the theme and the name.
When we talk about this risk-free trade, we're really talking about hedge funds mostly today are benefiting from that.
That's correct. That's probably the biggest segment of investors into the SPAC trust on the IPO.
Okay, so for most of the audience, that piece is not accessible. So let's talk about the piece that, back to your original thought about, this is essentially a chance to invest in, but do venture investing in the public markets, and should be attractive to a retail investor, any investor, for what purposes? What's the benefit there? It sounds good, but what is the true opportunity from an investment standpoint?
Well, I think the opportunity, if you think about just like investing in venture capital, forget that it's public or private. I think everyone over the last decade, especially, has sort of lamented in the public markets that companies are staying private longer and public investors haven't had access to these fast growth private companies. And so I actually think SPACs are sort of a return to introducing those types of companies into the public markets. It doesn't come without risk. I think the common criticism of a lot of the SPACs that are coming out today is that these companies don't have any revenue in some cases. They may be very unprofitable in other cases. They may have technology that's 5 years out. But if you're investing in venture capital, that's sort of commonplace. And so what I think retail investors sort of have to do is develop this new muscle and learn to think like a venture capitalist, where you aren't able to just assess, numbers, financial metrics that are common to a normal public company. You have to think about technology. You certainly have to think about the sponsors who are backing these SPACs. And you have to think about it with a very long-term view, especially in a market where a lot of these SPACs, like we talked about, are being marked up pretty aggressively after they get announced.
Okay, majority of this conversation has been about the retail investor. And here at Loup TV, we do it all. We're going to talk about potential SPAC targets here in a minute here. But I just want you to kind of tighten up that thought about, as a retail investor, how should you think about SPACs? I mean, there's a lot of them coming to market. We don't give investment advice. We're just your opinion. What would be your opinion on how to approach these?
And my opinion would be to look for a good sponsor. And what is a good sponsor? I mean, we just did a piece on this, and I think there's really three key components, and it sort of results in a fourth. I mean, a good sponsor, number one, we're talking about SPACs as sort of this venture capital mechanism. I think a good sponsor should understand how to invest in companies earlier on in their life cycles. That doesn't necessarily mean they have to be venture capitalists, but I think they should be people who understand early stage companies, not just mature companies with profitability that we kind of commonly see in the public markets. The second piece is they should be able to understand the technology fairly deeply. I think that not every sponsor is equal on that front. Some sponsors are, I think, highly technical and highly capable of assessing technology and what the future holds for that technology, and other sponsors aren't. So you want a very technically capable sponsor. And then the third piece is, I think you want a sponsor that can bring some attention to the company. Most of these SPACs, as they come out, will probably have valuations maybe somewhere in the low end of around $1 billion. Maybe when we get toward the high end, it might be in the mid to high single digit billions, depending on the success post deal. And so you're talking about largely small cap companies. I mean, that's pretty much a small cap range at this point. And small cap companies don't get a lot of attention historically from institutional investors. So I think a sponsor that can raise a company's profile, kind of help them with the near-term valuation, it gives the company a little bit more optionality. I think that's the third big benefit of a sponsor. And if you put all of those together, what ultimately should happen is good sponsors that can do those three things should get access to good companies. And that's the fourth criteria I think every investor, retail or institutional, should look for from a sponsor, is that they're bringing to public good companies.
My follow-up question was around, as a company who's thinking about doing a SPAC, what advice would you give about sponsors? I think you just answered it, what those characteristics are. I can tell you this, is that if I was a company, Doug, I would for sure want you to sponsor my SPAC. So
Right back
keep
at
that in
you.
the back of your mind. Yeah, right back at you. On behalf of Doug and the SPAC theme, which we're just going to hear a lot more about in the years to come, and myself, on Loup TV's behalf, bye for now.